Great. Okay. Yeah. So I think we can get started. I'm sure more people will trickle in as we continue. So welcome to the Designing Out Waste for the Circular Economy Symposium held by the Circular Economy Symposium at Harvard, HCES. My name is Kathy Zhang, and I'll be your moderator for today. So just a little bit about me. I am a senior research engineer at Saint-Gobain, which is a global manufacturing company that recently committed to carbon neutrality by 2050 and is currently transitioning and supporting a transition to the circular economy. So today I'm really excited to welcome a number of speakers, which I will introduce in just a moment, to discuss how manufacturers are thinking about the design and manufacturing of both materials and devices to reduce waste. And just to kind of set the stage for those of you who are maybe less familiar with this topic or maybe new to this topic, I wanted to help paint a picture of the current situation. So we all know consumer electronics pretty well. These are our phones and our laptops. And according to the e-waste monitor, over 50 million tons of electronic waste is generated per year. To give you a sense, kind of a visceral sense for what that is one bag of 60 cell phones or equivalent to kind of 3 laptops worth of material that is generated per person per year. And along with it, it's all of the plastic, all of the rare earth metals, and kind of in some cases, the toxic substances in these electronics that either go into landfill or essentially go into landfill. And so, currently only about 15 to 25% of electronics get recycled. There are many reasons for this. One of it is because there aren't very many efficient and safe ways for recycling and reusing devices, particularly as our devices get more and more complex. And so toward keeping that in mind, we've essentially assembled today a panel of panelists that kind of span the supply chain. And Sandra, if you can switch to the next slide, please. So here on the left, we have Sean and Susannah, who kind of represent the device side of the device manufacturing side of the supply chain. And on the right, we have Pierre from DOW, who represents the raw material supplier side of the supply chain. And so we're really excited to have Sean, Susanna, and Pierre here today. And so just to give you a sense for how this is going to work, for the next roughly 15 to 20 minutes or so, I will introduce the speakers and then give them a chance to share what their company is doing to support a transition to a circular economy. And then after that, we have prepared a number of questions that we hope to kickstart a conversation between the panelists, and we're hoping this is a lively and engaging dialogue. And finally, we will have time at the end for audience questions. So please feel free at any point during the panel to add questions to the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. So with that, I guess we can start. I will introduce our first speaker. So this is Sean Ansett, who is president at Stake Advisors. So Sean has a very lengthy list of relevant experiences, and we're really excited to be able to hear from him today. So Sean is a sustainability professional with 20 years of experience. He provides strategic advice to corporations, social enterprise startups, UN agencies, and nonprofit organizations on ethical trade, human rights, and environmental sustainability globally as president at Stake Advisors. In the past, Sean was a co-founding team member and chief sustainability officer at Fairphone, so actually the first chief sustainability officer, and the director of corporate responsibility at Burberry in London, where he was responsible for ethical trade, environmental sustainability, and community investment programs. He is also the co-founder of Future Fit Foods. Sean was also the director of global partnerships at Gap, where he led Gap's social responsibility and stakeholder engagement strategy related to labor, environmental, and human rights issues. He was the chief architect behind the company's stakeholder engagement strategy, significantly enhancing the company's reputation and impact, and formerly the executive director of the Bangladesh Safety Accord. Additionally, he is a Cradle to Cradle 2 Standards Steering Committee member, senior associate and tutor at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, chairman of the Board Liberty and Justice Clothing, advisory board member of At Nest, and a member of the Guild of Future Architects. So maybe some of you in the audience recognize some of these names. Sean has a master's degree in sustainability leadership, University of Cambridge, Wolfson College, and a Master of Science degree in business administration. And so with that, I would like to hand the stage to Sean. Sean, before you begin, so I'll give you an option to answer one of two questions. So first of all, one question is, what defines kind of the urgency or the magnitude of the electronic waste problem today, and from your perspective across all of these different roles that you've played. So that's one option, and then the other question is whether you have a favorite COVID food. So go ahead, Sean.
Hey, Kathy. First of all, thank you very much for the overly generous introduction. We got some amazing panelists with us today as well. Obviously, electronic waste is a significant and growing existential threat to climate change issues in our planet. So, there are many contributors, but you threw out some statistics earlier. We still heavily rely on minerals and extracting minerals. So a very important material issue to ourselves and all of our livelihoods around the world. Been making a lot of eggplant parmesan and multiple rounds of sourdough bread. So been enjoying comfort food while under lockdown here in Boulder. So thanks again.
Thanks. Yeah, that's I love eggplant parmesan. So with that, feel free to I guess present Fairphone's vision toward circular economy and your work while you were there.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy. So first of all, hello, everybody. Thank you, Harvard's Circular Economy Symposium, for the invitation and being here today to share with you all, as well as my fellow panelists. Firstly, full transparency, I'm not a material scientist, and I see in the chat there are many. I don't have a science background, as Kathy mentioned, but I just wanted to share sort of our story at Fairphone when I was involved in the company. I'm here representing At Stake Advisors, my advisory based in Boulder. And I wanted to also mention and recognize that I'm zooming in from my home that sits upon land within the territories of the UT Cheyenne and Arapaho people, and also acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations that were historically tied to the land here in Colorado. Can you change the slide, please? As I thought about this designing out waste in consumer electronics panel, it really took me back to Fairphone's founding and a friend of mine, Bas van Abel. At that time, he was a creative director of the VOG Society, sort of open technology and democracy group. Prior to that, he was the executive director of the Fab Lab. Some of you are probably familiar with the Fab Lab. So really, important in the makers movement in the Netherlands. Bas visited the Democratic Republic of Congo. Boy, it must be 12 years ago or so, and was really shocked by what he saw in the minings. This is well before the legislation, Dodd-Frank and others, where now we have more awareness around the human rights issues. Poor working conditions, environmental destruction, tin, tantalum, and gold mining, and fueling conflict in the region. So this is actually a shot he took of a piece of cobalt that he foraged while in country. He decided at the time that something really needed to be done about this, and really to understand the system, that we should become a part of the system and work to improve it from the inside out. So really from that initial design intent. And it was really the ethos of Fairphone from the beginning to design a smartphone that was designed for longevity, repairability, upgradability, and also support the software for a long period of time. And then when it was at the end of its useful life, after it cycled many times through the system and continued to create value, that'd be easy to dismantle through modularity and other options. So he really did follow the credo, right? If you can't open it, you don't own it. And we still believe that today at Fairphone. Let's remember that, roughly most estimates, about 80% of products' environmental impact happens in the design phase. So it really does take that design intent from the very beginning. I'm just going to show you a very short video next. You might say it's shameless advertising, but really it's an opportunity to illustrate where the company has landed over the last 8 years or so. And also realize that some of you on this webinar may have not heard of Fairphone. We're based in Amsterdam and sell just in through Europe at this time. So if you can please show the video.
Say hello to the new Fairphone, the phone that cares for people and planet, as well as swipes and posts. It takes great photos, even in low light. It has sleek styling, full day battery life for your very full days, dual SIM, and a unique modular design that's easy to repair in case you, oops. This is a phone that is built to last, but what really matters is how it's made. The new Fairphone uses fair materials, like Fairtrade Gold. It's made with recycled plastics, and we strive for fair conditions for the workers. This is what you support when you own a Fairphone. Because in a world that doesn't seem to care, caring is the most radical thing you can do. The new Fairphone, out now.
Great. But, driving all this change certainly is not easy, and we continue to struggle with circularity. I'm sure as my fellow panelists do as well. Just take a look for, one example in the first Fairphone of just the tin supply chain. That's the black, kind of if you follow the black guidelines there. Tin, as you may or may not know, is used to make solder paste, which you use to solder components to the circuit board of your phone. And just in this example, tin travels, in this case, from the DRC, then to Tanzania. It's then smelted in Malaysia, then turned into solder paste in India, before it's used in the assembly supplier in China to attach those components to circuit boards. So that's just one example of the supply chain and all the steps involved to get it into a product. And imagine a smartphone roughly has over 1,000 parts and literally dozens of elements. So this can become quite challenging quite quickly. Next slide, please. And just to sum things up, Wilberforce, who's an abolitionist, states how transparency drives change, and transparency is critical in circularity. While we embed this by enabling repair, providing DIY upgrades, we also drive transparency by taking the consumer upstream to the source of materials, disclosing what Fairphone calls fair deals, including where your money goes when you buy our product. And I just want to thank you for that, and I look forward to speaking more in the session coming up.
Thank you, Sean. I look forward to understanding or learning more about kind of the key challenges that you faced in this really, really interesting kind of network that you showed in the last slide with the supply chain. So I guess next up we have Susanna Calvin. So Susanna is Manager of Environmental Initiatives at Apple. And so she too has significant experience in this area. Susanna leads Apple's closed loop initiative. She is responsible for transitioning all of Apple's products to source recycled and renewable material. Susanna has spent the last 10 years identifying opportunities to embed environmental initiatives like zero waste, clean energy, and now circular economy into traditional operations and procurement practices. Susanna first joined Apple in manufacturing design before transitioning to procurement, leading operations environmental initiatives. Prior to joining Apple, Susanna worked in procurement and corporate responsibility at Black Diamond. She is an alumna of the University of New Hampshire and Brigham Young University. So Susanna, same question for you. From your perspective at Apple, and what does the electronic waste problem kind of look like, and why is it an urgent problem?
Sure. Hi, everyone. First off, thanks for having me. It's delightful to be here. When I think about this e-waste challenge, it's hard to think about it separate of the past year that we've seen, where nobody could have anticipated the year thus far. And it seems like every single day there's countless very humbling reminders that nature is bigger and way more powerful than any one of us, and that the ability to solve worldwide challenges like e-waste, like climate change, really depend on historic innovation, incredible collaboration, and our rapid attention. And I just think that we have such a responsibility to play, to think about how e-waste, just as Sean mentioned ago, is so interconnected with climate change. And it provides both, it's a challenge as well as a solution for us being able to contribute and collaborate, as I mentioned before. So the sense of urgency is ever present. And I think this past year really is a reminder of the dramatic force that nature is for us, and the responsibility that we have to protect it.
Yes, indeed. So feel free to share your slides, I guess.
Happy to, thank you. So very, very appreciative of being able to join the panel today, and I'm excited to talk about this topic. It's a true passion of mine to consider how we design outwaste. And as you heard from Kathy a minute ago, at Apple, my responsibility is across all of our circularity, which starts with product design, which is a huge component of both the challenge and the solution. My team engages a lot with all of our industrial design and product design teams to determine what types of materials we should have in our products, how they should be constructed. We then partner with our manufacturing teams as well as our suppliers to understand how we can reduce the amount of material in our supply chain and ensure that it's responsibly managed. And then our final focus is on recycling innovation and how we can be stewards of our products at end of life. And at Apple, we believe that the private sector has a very important role to play in driving this circular economy adoption. So if you click to the next slide, I just wanted to show very high level schematic of what this looks like to us. And I know that those of you on the call are very familiar, and our panelists very familiar with what the traditional linear supply chain looks like. And Sean spoke to this a minute ago, where the material that, that photo that you had from the Congo it's extracted from the earth, and that material is then processed, and customers love it, enjoy it. And then at the end of life, it ends up in a handful of waste streams, predominantly in landfill, in drawers, and very little of it actually recycled. And so our vision for circular economy looks a lot more like this, where we start with sourcing recycled and renewable materials. At Apple, we have a goal of all of our products being made from 100% recycled and renewable materials. So in a very, very ambitious goal tied to not only our resources of reducing our dependence on mining, but also reducing the carbon footprint of Apple. And in July of this past year, we actually committed to being carbon neutral for our entire value chain by 2030. So Kathy, it was great to hear your company going after the same ambition in 2050. And I think that many more companies are beginning to demonstrate this leadership. So this circular economy goal is very tied to our climate targets. So the first part of that is, sourcing the right material. The second part is then to design efficiently and manufacture efficiently so that we minimize the overall amount of material that we have to mobilize to produce our products. And then as you continue around the circle, product longevity is a huge focus of ours, where we aim to extend product life as long as possible by not only building and designing the most durable product, but ensuring there are repair options and services so that the product can live through multiple customers' hands and multiple lives. And then lastly, if you follow the circle all the way around, then that we ensure that our materials, we spend a lot of time on innovation and ensuring that, that our materials have the opportunity to be collected and recovered at end of life so that they can go back up to becoming the raw material that's sourced at the beginning of the supply chain. So this is our vision for what circular economy likes. I know certainly other companies, there's polymers on the call, we've fashion on the call, and I think everybody has a slightly different version of this, but the principles are the same, that we reduce our dependence on mined material and that we reduce the overall amount of material that we consume collectively. If you go to the next slide, then I just want to show you some of our progress that I'm frustrated. Apple just had an announcement this morning for the new iMac and iPad Pro that came out. And this slide in particular is from an announced last fall. I just wanted to highlight some of the types of work that we're doing, but it is now very common and absolutely the requirement that when we talk about new products being announced, in addition to the incredible feature set that we come out with, that we're also every single product coming out with new claims and new introductions of recycled and renewable content. So things like 100% recycled rare earth elements, 100% recycled tungsten, responsibly managed wood fiber. These are all absolutely commonplace now across our products and absolutely the expectation. The IMAC that was just announced about an hour ago, I believe has all the, similar claims. There's 100% recycled tin claim in the solder of the main logic board. And that goes back to what Sean was showing in his map a minute ago, that it's very challenging. The traditional primary supply chains for these materials come with very significant human rights, environmental risks. And so the strategy that we're pursuing at Apple is to convert all of our material choices to responsible and recycled content, as you're seeing here. As of this past year, I think 12% of all of the materials used in our products come from recycled and renewable content. So we're making good progress. We still have a long ways to go before we get to 100%, but this is a huge focus of ours. And perhaps one more slide, please. Most importantly, we do this while remaining profitable. And I particularly like this quote from Tim, that you don't have to choose between doing good and doing well. This is something that we keep top of mind at all times, because we want the work that we're doing to scale beyond Apple so that others can follow our lead. And by showing that new products are desirable to customers when they prioritize both new feature sets as well as our environmental efforts is a great example that it's a false choice today, now more than ever, to choose one or the other. So this is particularly encouraging for us as we build our supply chain in the direction of a circular rather than a linear approach. Looking forward to the discussion and any questions you have. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna, for sharing kind of Apple's vision for moving toward a circular economy. Indeed, it's really ambitious, but it is very inspirational. So the next and final speaker, last but not least, we have Pierre Descamps, who is a fellow at DOW. And so Pierre, feel free to go ahead and share kind of your thoughts on the magnitude of the problem from the raw materials side of things, as well as your DOW's approach toward this issue. Oh, would you mind unmuting yourself?
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, in fact, as Sean said, there is an increase in the waste, and it will continue to increase. And to realize that, you have two trends that you see in parallel. One trend is that more and more people have a desire to have a better connectivity. So the total market increase, and particularly in certain markets, they are developing. But beside that, there is also new trends related to further developed connectivity in developed countries. We're talking about 5G, we're talking about autonomous vehicle. We all have that in our vision. And in fact, it will accelerate the growth of the waste. And we have absolutely to do something. As a raw material supplier, we prefer to tell a material solution supplier, we can help and we want to help our customer to go and succeed in their journey towards a more sustainable world. But we also face the same issue. We need to develop internally a solution to recycle material that came out the dismounting of the device, and that we have to value to close the loop. So this is my view about your question, Kathy.
Great. And feel free to jump right into sharing DOW's vision and strategy.
Yeah. Can you move to the next slide? Yes, this one we can skip. Yes. Yeah, as a raw material supplier, I would like just to describe a little bit DOW and what DOW does in the electronic market. DOW is a chemical company. It's a large chemical company that employ more than 30,000 people in 109 sites all over the world in 31 countries. And in this role, we have the ambitions to become the world's most innovative, customer-centric, inclusive, and sustainable material science company. And this is very important for us because the population increase, and in fact, there is a kind of opposition between our desire to grow our business, but we need to separate this business growth from having a larger environmental impact on the society. So now, in all the product profile we work on, we think about the sustainable aspect of this product we want to provide. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah. And inside DOW, I will talk more about here what we call the consumer solution part of the company. This part of the company serve different markets and bring innovative and sustainable society in those markets. It includes the mobility, but also the consumer and electronics we are interested in today, but other business like high performance building. And each of us, we can work in a green aspect. In performance building, we can think about a green building, green city. Consumer electronic is working about reducing waste, making material repairable, but also helping developing the electrical vehicle business. So there is a lot of different activities and initiatives we have within this business. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah, and to develop our sustainability priority in DOW, we build on three pillars. The first pillar is climate protection. Climate protection is about CO2 emission and a lower carbon future. And we have initiatives in that domain. For example, we want to deliver the best compound, thermal conductivity compound. There's a key impact on the service life of the chip. They can decrease the power used by power electronics. We provide also material where we try to reduce the heat that this is required to cure it, trying to replace the heat by UV cure. So a lot of initiative in that direction. Another aspect about the sustainability is always using a safer material. And a safer material means remove all the toxic and make the material more good for the health. And for this, we try to eliminate all the BTX, so benzene, xylene, and toluene solvent out of our material. We try to avoid a MECO release during the cross-linking of our material. And we want to provide a more safe material. And in parallel, we try also to better understand the degradation of our polymer in natural environment. But because very often people may believe the silicone, because of the bigger energy associated to the SiO bond, it's a material that does not degrade. That's not correct. And there was not a lot of learning related to that. And we increase more and more of our learning about. And finally, the third pillar is the circularity. And in that field, we have two types of action. So we work internally. For example, we use certified charcoal to produce a silicone that is used for our chemistry. The carbon being used to reduce the silica and produce silicon metal. But also we help our customer to go for a better repairability, for a better dismounting of the device. And it is illustrated by the next slide. Please, could you move to it? Yeah, this is a typical example of the type of thinking we have about repairability. This is a thermal conductive pad that is for gold to eliminate or remove the heat from a chip to a part of the device that has a larger heat capacity in the middle of the phone. And the target was to make a pad that you can really, that stick, but you can really detach it without leaving any material on the device, so that you can repair the device. And for this one, we did particularly good because we also combined with another benefit. The material is able to cure by the heat that generated by the cell during the QA test. So you skip also the curing into an oven. So this is the end of my talk, or my introductory talk, just to I hope I help you to understand better what we try to do in this domain. And now I will be very happy to answer the question. So thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Pierre. It's interesting. Thank you for kind of sharing some of the detailed, details and a successful example of how you've been able to start working some of these principles into DOW's products. And so I think moving forward, we're going to go into the Q&A session. So we do have a few questions that have been compiled by the team. And so I'm hoping that you can all kind of chip in and or chime in on answers. But I'm going to start with a question directed toward Susan. So here, what does a fully circular economy in the consumer electronics sector look like? I know you shared a little bit of this in your slides as well. And then from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges today that keep us from achieving them? How do you think that we should go about overcoming them? And a kind of follow-up detail to that is, do these priorities kind of change in the short term versus the long term?
Yeah. I'll just mention a couple of things that all of the panelists have touched on in terms of this vision of that fully circular economy and supply chain. But the huge component of it is to dramatically reduce our reliance on new mined material. And that's going to be a very strong signal that we have accomplished the development of the circular supply chain when we are starting to use as much secondary material as is currently in use from the primary sector. So definitely we have to dramatically reduce the new mined material consumption that's happening across the sector. And on top, an extension of that is that we'll also see the full circular supply chain when those secondary materials are as preferential to customers and producers as primary materials are today. There's many reasons Pierre just mentioned that a tremendous amount of innovation required in order for new technologies and new alternatives to be as competitive as some of the traditional primary materials that we consume today. And so when we get to a fully circular supply chain or circular economy, we will start to see these secondary alternatives having the performance, the supply, cost parity with primary material, and that we're not quite there yet today, which is, I suppose, the second part of your question, which is what are the challenges? In my mind, the challenges start with customer collection, and Kathy, you mentioned this at the beginning. Statistically, 30 to 50% of devices are in drawers today, and I'd be curious to know from those who are the attendees in the meeting, how many of you could raise your hand and say, exactly, my drawer beside my bed or my drawer in my kitchen is loaded with cables and cords. And as we've moved from the CRT TV, these big devices, to smaller devices packed with all sorts of critical materials, this hibernation challenge is very real. And there's plenty of reasons for that. You started to go through those, Kathy, but consumer behavior just generally is that it's easier to leave them in our drawers than it is to participate in the return of products. So one of the biggest challenges is that the customer involvement side, because we need more supply in order to perpetuate the circular design that we're all talking about. Second comes to mind from a challenge perspective is waste shipment. And I wouldn't expect, if the people in the attendee group have their sleeves rolled up and are working on moving materials across the world, then they know this challenge, but it's perhaps a little bit less known, is that there's a lot of regulations, very well founded, that prevent the movement of secondary materials as freely as primary materials move today. So shipping batteries around the world, for example, or importing material from a country where there may have been, devices in developed countries, and we are trying to move them back into the upstream supply chain. If you think back to Sean's map at the beginning, this is a global supply chain that we're talking about. And to prevent illegal dumping, there's very strict restrictions about moving materials across boundaries and borders. And that becomes a challenge for developing the circular economy because it puts secondary materials at a flexibility disadvantage. So working within the regulations that exist today is time consuming and in some cases altogether blocked. So that's a challenge, certainly one that we respect and we're working very hard with policymakers and within the regulations to ensure that that protection is maintained, but that we enable materials to flow to perpetuate the circular economy responsibly. And then it was also touched on briefly is like innovation generally across the sector is a huge challenge, both on, there's a lot of incredible work being done by companies like DOW to develop new material alternatives that allow for higher recycled content or renewable content. And then, but if you think about that full spectrum, we get to end of life. Recycling generally is a quite antiquated industry. Much of the recycling technology was developed 30, 40, even 50 years ago. And we're beginning to see, and also it was scaled for these bigger electronic devices. And again, coming back to like the small iPhones that we all have now and other products, it's hard for all of these priority materials to be recovered at end of life with today's recycling technology. So it's been very exciting to see new companies and new alternatives to traditional shred and sort processes coming online, because that's going to be a really big piece of what unlocks the material availability for us. So I'll just simply wrap up the short-term versus long-term challenge. I think that you know, there's demonstrations that we need to make now. Apple, for example, is very focused on meeting our ambitious environmental targets of 100% recycled and renewable material carbon neutrality to demonstrate what's possible, sort of a demand signal to the market to show consumers, you know, this is what you should be requiring of the companies from whom you choose to purchase products. And then in the longer term, really engaging with industry, policymakers, community leaders to accelerate some of these critical components of circular economy, everything from, as I mentioned, customer collection, waste shipment, innovation, all those sorts.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. I think this actually will be interesting to hear kind of Sean's perspective on how downstream customers should interact with upstream materials suppliers to bridge the circular economy, because I think that kind of flows naturally from what you were talking about in terms of the downstream suppliers kind of applying pressure on upstream suppliers. So Sean, if you could kind of speak to how do downstream customers interact with upstream material suppliers to bridge the circular economy, and to what extent does collaboration kind of exist across different industries and with players from the same industry?
Sure, thank you, Kathy. It's essential, obviously, for a company like Fairphone, since we're a very small player in a very large market with real dominant actors involved. So, and one thing that was fascinating to me, moving from the apparel sector into electronics, and now I do some ag as well, was the power dynamics are very different in the sector, because some of the suppliers are literally the only people in the world that can do what they do, right? To get the electronics to function, whether it's material suppliers or even the assemblers themselves, because of some of the specialized techniques that they have. So that is dramatically different than other sectors. And I raise apparel simply because I know there are some participants here, and those supply chain relationships are different. Really, you know, I think most importantly is working very closely with communities and co-developing these processes together, right? These are the people that are going to be impacted by these changes, right? Both positively and negatively, and there are going to be trade-offs. I believe there was one question flagged up earlier. What happens when we close the loop in materials? What happens to these livelihoods that are on the ground? While they are challenging, right? There are issues, as we know, well reported, documented, of child labor, poor wages, environmental degradation, poor health and safety concerns. These may be the only jobs in the community at this time. So this is a challenge, whether you're talking about transitioning renewable energy in the United States, right? What happens to these workers in the extractive sector as well, right? Some would argue, well, that's a boom bust sector. Actually, if you look over time, wages can be much better in renewables simply because you're not living through these cycles of booms and busts, right? It's more continuous employment. And the circular economy, depending on where you're situated in the world, this is something we have to be really careful about in the North-South divide, is where are those new jobs in this new economy going to be generated? And I think if you look at most studies, it's not conclusive, and likely will benefit developed economies more than developing economies. So we have to be very careful of this tenuous situation as this transition takes place. There are a number of initiatives. They've been, some have been going on for some time. Most of you be aware of the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation does, or certifications like Cradle to Cradle. They're looking right through the whole value chain, but now not just on the environmental aspects of the circular economy, but also on the S and the social aspects. And it's been gratifying to me to see this coming to light. And it was mentioned on the call, when we look at materials, we can't only look at the environmental factors. We need to take this holistically as we address this. I shouldn't say we, I'm not with Fairphone anymore, but Fairphone's made a deliberate decision to continue working with artisanal and small scale miners in some contexts. We were the first to integrate fair trade gold into consumer electronics. And there's only a couple sources in the world right now, and the intention is to develop fair trade gold supply chain in Africa. So working with multiple stakeholders, right, taking each sector's expertise, their experience, their local knowledge to account. So the local communities are involved in the co-design of these products and identifying what the needs are, right? So in brief, I'm just checking time. It's really focused on improving the conditions in the mines themselves, addressing the systemic issues of child labor, which oftentimes is lack of education and other issues, right, that are systemic there. Removing toxins from the process, because there are more improved techniques to, for example, extract gold, that requires investment. So how we set up an investment impact facility so those resources are there for improved health and safety and the like. And then, of course, providing market, right? No good if you've done all this and then there's no market to sell these products into. But I would say that, I'd like to be optimistic, but we will be relying on mineral extraction for some time to come. It's still very difficult to extract the minerals from any of these products. I know we focused on phones today. There's all sorts of electronics out there. And we want to make sure that we're improving the artisanal mining and small scale mining at this time to provide those opportunities while looking at closing the loop in other areas, because it's going to take many years to get there.
Yeah, it's interesting that both you and Susanna kind of touched on kind of mining as the critical kind of point for the transition to a circular economy, like really working with either transitioning away from miners or mining, or at least working with working in a responsible way with miners. So actually,
the other thing I would add on to that, yeah, Kathy, though, is the mining industry is a critical part of this transition, both from making sure that exits or reductions are responsibly managed, but also because the technology that a lot of these mining companies have developed over time, it really lends itself to recycling. At the core of it, it's all metallurgy. And so there's a tremendous role that we see in partnerships with traditional mining companies, as not only as we procure responsibly mined material that is, inevitably part of our transition plan, but also to move their business models to where they're actually also, doing traditional extraction from tailings ponds. And, you could even think about landfill mined material as a sector for traditional mining companies to get into in a different way than they are today. So there's a really strong role to play in collaboration with these companies.
Yeah, and in terms of material supplier, we see the same need for partnership, because in fact, recycling waste is a kind of a similarity between chemical engineering. It's all about flow. In fact, if you want to build a recycling process, you need to have a flow in that much as possible the capacity of your the recycling capability. That's very important. And there is another flow that is very important as well, is that recycling process, you have a flow out. And where do you use this flow out of material? Do you want to go and position it in a lower value market? This is a very complex process. And talking about what you talk, Susanna, about the transportation of material, I will talk about the transportation of waste. For example, I can talk about the Basel Convention related to that. You know all about that. It's a very good idea because we want to avoid a developed country to dump their waste in developing country. But this good thing as a kind of a bad payback, the way it is defined now, because it may provide ways to cross the border. As a global company, if we want to recycle our material, we need to position the recycling plant somehow. And basically, we need to be able to feed that plant with our material. So we need to be able to have that waste stream to cross the border. So it's extremely good, and this Basel Convention, and I will not question, but I think it would deserve some discussion about trying to understand all the benefit, the pros and cons, and make it in a way that it helps protecting the waste dumping, but also facilitate the move of the good waste stream towards recycling plant that work in the best practice.
Thank you, Pierre. That's a really important point. And I think we had a question here originally for you that was related to how does one encourage designers to think about material recovery and designing out waste? And what are some strategies that designers or manufacturers can use to basically help make this transition? And I think an important relevant question related to what you just said is, given the kind of complexity of the recycling supply chain, how do you kind of consider all of those effects when you're simply designing the material, right? Because it can easily get very overwhelming. So.
Yeah, I would say the first part of the question, I understand it as a kind of what are the drivers? What are the motivation for a company like us? And again, I will take the view of the supply company, a raw material supply company. Of course, I don't talk about internal driver and the company ethic. I'm just talking more about external driver. For sure, the image is one of the key driver. And we listen about global warming, about the Paris deal, about carbon reduction. It has a large echo in developed countries, and certainly we need to pay attention to that. As a raw material supplier, of course, customer is one of our drivers, because the customer can come and ask us, we want you to supply carbon-free material for a certain date. It's extremely complex statement, because what is a zero carbon material? We need to be sure we understand very well the action we need to put in place so that it really offers a solid and real solution. The third, for sure, are the investor. We are on the stock market, and there are investors, they are really consider the sustainability of one of their value as well as the social aspect. And of course, there is the ESG classification on the stock market that allow to help the investor selecting the company they want to finance because they have the same value than themselves. So it's another incentive. Another one, it's about raw material shortage, but there Susanna and Sean already told about. The last one is about the country and the state. An example is the Green Deal in Europe. In fact, with that type of initiative, you cannot avoid. Basically, they say if you want to sell a material in Europe, you want to have those criteria related to sustainability. And they play with positive things and negative things. They say you can have a penalty, you can have eco tax, you cannot sell on that market, but you have also a positive point, like you can have tax relief for the good players. They are really creating big funding program. In fact, 80% of the money that is will be collected from eco tax will be redistributed for large funding programs. So it's really another important point. And finally, what I see is really removing existing barriers. And existing barriers are, for example, lack of transparency and traceable system. They make people not really trusting the process, making greener our recycling industry. They are not all that green. And other break like the Basel Convention that I was talking about, because it can be seen as a break to the natural flow of waste for a proper treatment.
Thanks, Pierre. Sean and Susanna, do you have anything to kind of strong thoughts on that?
I'll jump in really quick, and then with Susanna. You know, we're up against a largely subsidized and linear system, right? So that we need to break this and build it back. We will not meet our goals based on your first initial question, Kathy, about the existential threat to us and planet. So that and Pierre has touched on incentives. There needs to be incentives, but also a good public policy put into place that's going to enable that to move forward, right? Even if we wanted to, we don't have the systems in place to make that happen. Now, you might have big resources that you can break it and build your own. We've seen some examples of that in electric cars and so forth. But we're up against a big challenge. So that's up to all of us to ask that of our policymakers and make sure there are good policies in place. There's interesting stuff happening, as you know. The EU, you know, we have the French repairability index, which is based off of some of the policies Pierre mentioned. And they're rating, you know, products, and let's see if there's real teeth, and if they actually start choice editing products that aren't repairable. These are the types of problems that engineers generally like, right? They like problems and they want to solve them. So there's a role of government to set some policies and guidance so we can drive innovation. Because some of those choice editing options will drive innovation if you want to get to market. So that's one incentive, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just echo the comments from both of the other panelists. Pierre, when you mentioned the Basel Convention, for example, that struck a very firm chord with me. It's something that when I mentioned waste shipment, it's the focal legislation regulations on the movement of materials. And this is a very complex topic, because what we're trying to balance is being responsible and being stewards of our materials and the best stewards of the environment and the people in the supply chains with how we manufacture our products. On the other hand, as Sean just mentioned, there are some real breakthroughs that are required and changes in to how materials move and how materials are categorized today in order for this circular vision to actually become a reality. So it requires deep engagement with policymakers and regulatory bodies to understand the intricacies of the challenges and then come up with solutions so that we don't regress on responsibility for the sake of promoting this alternative manufacturing vision.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So we're almost at time here. I want to at least have kind of one question that is kind of aggregating a few questions that have showed up in the Q&A. So given this is a very big problem, what are some short-term levers that manufacturers can kind of pull to start making progress in that direction? And just an example here. So for example, in the construction industry, typically, you know, when you're starting to design, manufacture, or design more sustainable products, you might not initially market it as a sustainable product, but it's really a product that's easier to assemble for the contractors. So it's something, you know, it's something that people can immediately understand and is willing to pay for. So in the electronics industry, is there kind of an analog for that? And how would you think about something like that?
Kathy, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Sure. Two quick concrete thoughts come to mind. One is design choices. And there's a question, I've been going through all the questions in the chats. Thank you for all the really thoughtful comments. Morgan just asked about, you know, is the challenge more on the rare earths and metals than it is on plastics? And to try to answer your question and answer yours, Kathy, at the same time, all materials should be evaluated, and there's a lot of great alternatives. If you're talking about the, you know, carbon-free steel, inert anode aluminum, recycled, bio-based, renewable plastics, polymers, and there's a tremendous amount of innovation that's coming down the pipe for alternatives to some of the more traditional materials. The challenge is not limited to just the metals. Plastics has a wealth of challenges just because of the different types of resins and fillers and the complexity of polymers in general as a category. So my first recommendation short term is focus on the design, focus on where you can make alternative design choices so that you are prioritizing recycled and renewable content out the gate. And then on the back end, we have just recently started producing recycler guides available on our website for public consumption, but to give instructions on how to recycle products at end of life responsibly so that you are not only doing it safely by EH&S standards, but also extracting the priority materials that are embedded within our products. So I think there's an element of transparency that's also incumbent upon producers to, you know, to be responsible at both ends, both on the design choices up front and then thinking through end of life.
Great, thank you, Susanna. Pierre and Sean, do you have, you know, just a sentence or anything that you'd like to share to wrap up, or?
Just to tell that inside a different company, we see everywhere initiative and a real boost towards sustainability. And in a company like us, they are in very different business. We provide plastics. We have the problem of plastic waste as well. At each level of the company for the different industries, we have big initiatives that they are in place, going in the right direction. So there is a lot of hope associated to that dynamic.
Great, thank you.
I'll wrap up quickly because I know we're just slightly over time. We talked about this, but just to emphasize, we fundamentally need to change the relationships that we have with our suppliers right through the value chain if we're going to drive the circular economy. This can no longer be us versus them over pennies and nickels. This needs to be about us, how we're going to work together, how we're going to recover these materials, how we're going to responsibly lobby governments to make these changes that we need. And that's going to take, and hope maybe we've all learned this in COVID, right? More mindfulness, more empathy, putting yourself in the other person's shoes and actively listening to their needs. And until we drive that, it's going to continue to be fragmented and very challenging for all of us.
Thank you, Sean. So we are at time, and thank you for everyone for sharing your questions. We do have content coming up on the Harvard Circular Economy website every once in a while, so we'll try to touch on a lot of these questions in that format. And thank you so much to everyone for joining. I'd like to also thank the rest of the Harvard Circular Economy Symposium team, especially Ryan Brush and Sandra Negron, and many others for helping to coordinate this event. Thank you, everyone, and hope you have a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Great.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining.